From the outside, it looks like a seductive dark romance. A woman betrayed, a stranger with power, a kiss that changes everything. But beneath that surface, this story is really about the psychology of attachment. How pain can rewire desire, how trauma can disguise itself as love, and how people raised around control often mistake intensity for protection. Sloane believes she is escaping humiliation, yet every step forward drags her deeper into a world built on violence, legacy, and emotional dependency. The real question is not whether she falls for him. The real question is, when love grows in the shadow of fear, is it salvation or simply a more beautiful prison?
In the face of betrayal, Sloane Mercer's instinct was retaliation. As a 2-year bond shattered, she suppressed a rising scream. Her gaze found an unknown man whose immense calm offered a strange stability, and she proposed a contract. A 10-second feigned kiss. He offered a simple nod. The stranger's reaction lacked any pretense of casualness. He acted with purpose, angling her chin with a frightening authenticity before kissing her amid the throng, erasing the world around them. The embrace held more substance than her lover had offered in 2 years. As he withdrew, Sloane found herself breathless. Her now ex-lover was paralyzed behind her, his expression one of utter disbelief. She would not grant him a backward glance. Her new accomplice met her eyes with unsettling composure and noted, 8 seconds, but it was effective. Sloane was yet unaware that this single act had declared a war they were unequipped for. I am Lena. This is where my analysis begins. Chapter 1. The perfectly timed, incorrect kiss. The inciting incident. Noir's 5 IP restroom door opened, demolishing a 2-year history in under 3 seconds. Mateo stood there, his shirt partially unbuttoned, a careless smile on his face. He was accompanied by 2 women, one on the marble counter, the other with champagne, both in a state of revealing disarray. Sloane's response was a paralytic freeze. No tears or outrage came, a clinical deviation from a typical trauma response. She silently counted to 10, a fragile mooring in chaos, before turning and leaving without a sound. Noir's calculated dimness only heightened the surreal, nightmarish quality of the moment. The club's music was a thick, disorienting pulse of sound. Roughly 10 paces later, she met Bex, her 7-year confidant and fellow tattooist. Bex appeared in the shadowed hall as if by pure intuition, her emotional compass locating Sloane in the gloom before a word could be spoken. Bex's eyes darted from Sloane's expression to the VIP door and back, deciphering the entire disaster in her friend's gaze. It was then that Bex offered what was perhaps the most profoundly useless counsel imaginable for a moment of complete ruin. Breathe, was Bex's suggestion. I am breathing, Sloane countered, moving past her to the bar. Noir's counter was gold-veined black marble, illuminated to cast each beverage as a lure. She chose an outrageously priced drink, a minor destructive act to mirror her internal turmoil. In a sudden turn, her elbow connected with the man next to her. He was tall, occupying his space with an easy authority in a tailored, dark suit. He held his whiskey with the remote composure of someone for whom surprise was an alien concept. His deep, steady gaze met hers, and the apology forming on her lips vanished, captured by his sheer intensity. Sorry, she eventually forced out. He acknowledged this with a subtle nod, his wordless evaluation of her proceeding with a disquieting calm, as if observing a pawn in a larger game. She moved to retrieve her glass, but he remained still. Sloane, came Mateo's voice, a tone now laced with menace, from just behind her, its slight accent another facet of his deceit. His proximity and his cologne, now irrevocably tied to betrayal, ignited a purely instinctual response. She pivoted back to the unknown man. He remained, whiskey held loosely, observing her like an audience member awaiting the conclusion of a drama. Leaning close, her voice became a hushed, desperate appeal. stripped of any artifice. "Please," she breathed, "pretend you're with me for just 10 seconds." He appraised her, his eyes briefly shifting past her, likely toward Mateo. A minute change in his features signaled a swift and final calculation. His gaze returned to hers. After a 2-second pause, he set down his glass, held her face, and kissed her. This moment warrants a deeper look. This was far from a brief contact. His hand was a solid, warm presence on her skin, while his other steadied him against the bar, an anchor in her spiraling reality. He kissed her with a slow purpose, as if each second was intended to be a deliberate declaration. During 4 distinct seconds, her consciousness emptied, erasing all context: the champagne, the room, her attire, even her identity. When he retreated, the space between them felt electric, thick with the residual energy of a boundary that was now permanently breached. His intense gaze remained on hers, holding an emotion she couldn't name but was powerless to break away from. A profound quiet emanated from behind her. She ventured a look back. Mateo was there, his jaw slack, his ready-made apologies stillborn, his expression a tableau of raw, unadulterated shock. Then Mateo's features hardened, his gaze constricting. He pivoted and departed without speaking, a withdrawal that served as its own admission of guilt. The man at her side paused until Mateo had vanished, then regarded her, a faint smile touching his lips. 8 seconds, he rumbled, but it proved effective. She escaped to the washroom with Bex, who seized her arm and began a desperate inquiry. "Who is that man?" Bex pressed, her tone edged with alarm. "Sloane, who was he?" "I have no idea," Sloane replied, presenting the single horrifying truth she possessed. In another part of the club, the man in the suit agitated the whiskey in his glass as an associate neared. This was Soren Vale, his senior by some 15 years, his expression a mask and his bearing that of a man long burdened by perilous knowledge. "Are you aware of his identity?" Soren inquired softly, his gaze locked on the space Mateo had just vacated. "The one she was with." The suited man hesitated before answering. When he finally turned, his expression showed no shock, only the frigid certainty of a hunter that has located its prey. "Mateo Varga," he stated without inflection. Soren waited, assessing his response. "Shall I monitor him?" "Maintain surveillance," the first man commanded. He then did something that clearly unsettled his subordinate. He remained, his attention fixed on the vacant corridor where Sloane had disappeared. He was Kyle Rienzo, a name as yet devoid of meaning for her. Chapter 2. A Serious Masquerade. Beyond Noir's entrance, the Manhattan night was brisk and cutting. The lengthy queue to enter felt like a bitter irony, a world proceeding as normal while hers had just disintegrated. Beck stood nearby, holding their coats and suppressing a barrage of inquiries, recognizing the need for quiet support over questions. Kyle Rienzo was positioned 2 steps behind them. Though unbidden, he followed them with a silent command that was more unnerving than an overt menace. At that moment, Mateo emerged. He exited from a side door with a determined gait, his features arranged for a prepared statement. But the sight of Sloane beside the man from the bar caused his fabricated composure to crack for a half-second before he restored it and approached them. "Sloane," Mateo started, his voice a masterclass in non-apology. "Let me explain what you witnessed." Then the mechanism tripped again. That cognitive disconnect, that primal impulse. She faced the stranger, who was observing her with anticipation, and voiced the absurd proposal before she could retract it. "Will you pretend to be my boyfriend?" she asked quietly. "For 1 month, only until he understands." The man paused for 3 entire seconds, a stillness where she battled the impulse to rescind the ludicrous offer. Then his hand came to rest on her waist with a steady, warm possessiveness that defied all reason, a fact her shattered composure could not process. "Done," was his sole reply. Mateo advanced another step. The man with Sloane remained motionless, regarding Mateo with the placid confidence of one who holds a superior position and senses no danger. That was sufficient. I observed the precise instant Mateo's resolve crumbled. The capitulation was visible first in his eyes, an uncontrollable flicker of concession. He held Cale's gaze for 2 full seconds, began to talk, then ceased and merely withdrew. Bex's face was a blank mask as she whispered urgently, "Sloane, I have no clue who he is, but you're explaining all of this in the car." Cale's sedan appeared at the curb, its back door already agape. Bex shot Sloane a 5-second look, her brows high with inquiry, before getting into a taxi. Sloane was then ushered onto dark upholstery beside a man whose family name was still a mystery. The car's interior was a soundless vault, isolating them from the city and everything else. Model. The city's lights smeared into streaks of orange and white on the window. A visual chaos I observed while attempting to organize my thoughts. "What is your complete name?" I inquired, directing my voice toward the glass. "Cale," he stated. The name hung in a silence he made no effort to break. I turned toward him, noting that same subtle smile. It was a keen, knowing look that conveyed a quiet contentment with the evening's progression. "And your surname?" I persisted. "Cale will suffice for the present," he responded. This was not evasion, but a statement of fact, delivered like an observation of the obvious. The subject was concluded. Sighing, I turned back to the window. "Last night was an anomaly," I declared. "Indeed," he concurred, his tone devoid of remorse. "I do not typically engage strangers in bars. I am aware of that," he said. "And I do not typically acquiesce." His words held no judgment, only another fact presented with his characteristic unnerving composure. His emotional distance was a more profound threat than any overt hostility. The vehicle came to a silent halt outside my residence on the Lower East Side, a location I had never disclosed. As I began to voice my inquiry, Cale preempted me, his gaze fixed on the world beyond the glass. He started, "Regarding the man from the club, exercise caution." An involuntary, anxious laugh was my body's response to a statement my mind refused to process. "You have no idea who he is," I countered. Cale's stare remained unwavering, his placid exterior concealing the machinations within. "I am perfectly aware of his identity," he stated. For a count of 3, I studied his features, attempting to reconcile his assertion with my reality, but the concepts failed to align. I exited the vehicle, approached my building, and paused, key in hand, his declaration echoing relentlessly in my mind. My phone vibrated at 2 a.m. The message was from Mateo. "A conversation is necessary. This has not concluded." I blocked his contact with the primal instinct to seal a barrier against a coming squall, affording doubt no entry. By morning, he was stationed outside my studio, his posture against the brickwork a study in feigned rationality. I spotted him through the window before he noticed my approach and for the space of 2 heartbeats contemplated retreat. A surge of defiance quelled the impulse. This was my domain, and our history granted him no claim. I entered the building. A tap sounded against the glass. I disregarded it. His vigil lasted for 40 minutes. I observed the passage of time on the clock before he at last departed. Subsequently, my phone signaled a call from an unlisted number. I accepted it, speculating it was Bex, whose erratic communication patterns I was attempting to anticipate. A deep voice inquired, "Does this require my intervention, or do you have the matter contained?" It carried a subtle accent, unrecognized the previous night, but now glaringly apparent. I remained immobile in my workspace. "Where did you acquire this number?" I asked sharply. A brief pause ensued. A Calla Rienzo undertaking is always seen through to its end, Sloane. The connection was then severed. I gazed at the device, the name Rienzo resonating as a signifier without a signified. In another location, Call placed his phone upon a glass surface while Soren, his subordinate, observed from a window, contemplating whether to voice a fully formed opinion. Soren's observation was an accusation. Family assets are being deployed to monitor a private citizen. The statement was not interrogative. "These are my assets," Cale countered, his focus on his documents. After a moment of silence, Soren engaged with his phone, the action a silent censure. Chapter 3, A Defective Emulation. On Tuesday at 11 in the morning, Cale manifested at my studio, uninvited, with 2 coffees in hand. It became clear the coming month would possess complexities I had not foreseen. He crossed the threshold with the certainty of a man who anticipates entry, and my own body complied, acting on pure impulse upon seeing him. He placed one beverage on my work surface, his attention sweeping the studio with that placid, evaluative stare I was starting to know. This was not inspection born of interest, but of cataloging. His gaze moved over the wall-mounted drawings, the furnishings, and the desk. Finally returning to me, his expression a perfect cipher, he noted, "Your inks are arranged chromatically." My correction was immediate. "By spectrum. The distinction is meaningful." He drank from his cup without comment, and I understood this was not a debate, but an act of data acquisition. Next came the terms, hastily written on a napkin. A lesson learned from Matteo that verbal contracts are specters. Their only substance is the subjective recollection of each party. I slid the napkin in Cale's direction. He examined it for a brief 2 seconds, his face inscrutable. The list contained 6 stipulations. Physical contact was forbidden outside the necessities of performance. Unannounced visits to my studio were prohibited, a term I registered he had already violated. He was not to make choices on my behalf. The arrangement was for 1 month, with renewal contingent on my consent. The final clause, drafted and redrafted 3 times, read, "No repetition of the events at Noir." Cale absorbed the text silently. He then produced a substantial black pen and affixed his signature to the napkin's corner with the gravity of a diplomat signing a treaty. I fixated on his, autographed for approximately 3 seconds, caught between amusement and profound disquiet. "That is a signed napkin," I observed. "You presented a napkin as a binding document," he countered. Honoring its form seemed appropriate. The issue with Cale was his unnerving proficiency in this entire affair. During the subsequent 10 days, his presence was required for 3 evening meals, an engagement at an establishment that reserved a table for him, and an informal Sunday meal with Bex, which was followed by 40 minutes of her fervent text-messaged endorsement. As we entered a space, the pressure of Cale's hand on my back registered as a calculated act of ownership, a claim intended for my awareness alone, and it was deeply felt. His manner of leaning close to converse in a crowded venue constructed a private sphere for us, excluding all others with practiced ease. It required a constant, conscious effort to remember the artificiality of the situation. Matteo's responses, meanwhile, were a predictable yet novel composite. The anonymous calls ceased after I adopted a policy of non-response. A delivery of white roses arrived on Wednesday, a significant gesture given the absence of such gifts during our 2-year relationship. He materialized near the studio on 2 other occasions, observing from the opposite side of the street. His surveillance possessed a chill that was distinct from mere jealousy. She perceived a more frigid, methodical observation, a quality for which she had no name. The sense of unease was archived alongside other dormant conflicts. On Thursday, the social function took place, located atop a midtown skyscraper where the panoramic cityscape served as a potent diversion from the room's occupants. The event's true objective remained opaque to her. Cale's label, a business dinner, was factually correct, yet concealed a more complex truth. A gradual realization emerged as she observed a uniform, controlled stillness in all the men. A state not of ease but of tension, as if each presided over an unseen dominion. For the initial 20 minutes, Cale remained by her side, facilitating introductions where names and faces merged into a blur beneath the gravity of the discussions. When his presence was requested elsewhere in the room, she found herself isolated, equipped only with a wine glass and an increasing conviction of an imperceptible underlying reality. At that moment, she conceded her own disorientation. Soren was positioned 2 paces to her left, the steady, silent fixture she was growing accustomed to. Addressing the single familiar figure, she gestured toward the assembly and remarked, "I feel as though this space operates by a hidden cartography that I alone am unable to decipher." Soren contemplated her statement before responding, his tone devoid of emotion, clinical. "You are interpreting it correctly. You are simply consulting the incorrect edition." His confirmation elicited a spontaneous, authentic laugh from her, a fleeting instant of relief. Upon turning, her sight met Cale's from across the room, his attention fixed upon her, his face a complete void. His observation of her was relentless, offering no clues for interpretation. For a single, arresting second, just before a man in a gray suit diverted his focus, the quality of his gaze transformed, bearing a gravity that surpassed all their previous visual exchanges. The intensity of that look landed like a corporeal impact, a sudden frost forming in her core. From his position, Soren's focus shifted from Cale to her, and then into the middle distance, his expression mirroring that of a strategist, witnessing the validation of his most dire hypothesis. Later that evening, my friend Bex called, dispensing with pleasantries. "An explanation is required," she began. "I observed that man's gaze on Sunday, Sloane, and among the many ways you are looked at by men, his is a category unto itself." "It is a contractually obligated performance," I responded. "Merely theater," Bex concurred. "And you are its intended audience, the single observer meant to be convinced." I offered no reply. Bex allowed the quiet to stretch, a calculated tactic designed to prompt introspection. Her final words before disconnecting were tonally akin to a director overseeing a play's conclusion, already knowing its calamitous outcome. Following the conversation, slumber became unattainable. At the stroke of midnight, the intercom emitted a piercing sound. Mateo's voice, stripped of emotion and stark, came through the device. "You are ignorant of the forces you are engaging," it declared. She suspended her breath, her pulse a frantic beat against her bones. The tone was not that of a jilted lover. It lacked any trace of masculine sorrow. It was a more clinical, systematic menace that her physical senses registered long before her intellect could categorize it. She eventually found sleep only with the hallway illuminated. Chapter 4: Where Simulation Becomes Reality. Cale's proposition to relocate to the mansion arrived on Friday, presented as a pragmatic necessity rather than a pivotal change in circumstance. To ensure your safety was his stated reason. The term lingered in the air between them, laden with a significance she could not yet decode. Her assent was a visceral response that circumvented rational thought, a sterile fact she elected to disregard. The residence was located in the Upper East Side, on a block where flawless exteriors projected a silent, unassailable power. Inside, the space was an immense and graceful penumbra. The acoustics seemed to absorb and densify all noise. A grand staircase ascended with the perfect confidence of its superior construction. She stood for 5 seconds in the entrance hall, consumed by the chamber's towering scale. "You have permission to interact with objects," Kal observed from her side. "I am conscious of my authorized actions," she retorted, before doing just that. The dilemma of cohabiting with Kale Rienzo was that no volume of space could diminish the acute, perpetual consciousness of his proximity. A shift in atmospheric pressure, or the unique cadence of his steps, would signal his entry into a room. Her focus would be drawn to him without volition. Saturday morning was spent in exploration, which led her to the library. In that room, the books were ordered by a dimension, a methodology that appeared organized yet felt fundamentally incorrect. Her attempt to impose order on her new reality manifested as she began reorganizing the library by color. Kale materialized in the doorway, his stillness a calculated pause. His gaze was a complex assessment she was only now beginning to interpret. It held neither judgment nor approval, but an unreadable state between them. "That is an act of heresy," he stated. "It is an aesthetic correction," she replied, her eyes fixed on a book's spine. A beat passed. "Do you intend to reorder the entire collection?" "That hinges on the length of my stay," she said. The words, with their unintended dual meaning, escaped before she could stop them. Kale offered no response. When she glanced up, he had vanished, leaving only his question to occupy the space. That Saturday night unfolded as a public spectacle, the type memorialized in society columns with carefully discreet images. She readied herself in the assigned chamber, her image captured in a gold-framed mirror. Descending the staircase in a moss-green gown of debatable propriety, she felt its rightness. Kale awaited her in the foyer. As she approached, a shift occurred in his eyes, a lowering of his usual guard. He made no comment on her dress, but the deliberate manner in which he opened the door was statement enough. During the intermission, Vivienne Lacroix emerged. She registered her first, statuesque, blonde, with a posture that broadcast the awareness of a woman always being observed. Vivienne moved toward Kale through the assembly with the fluid confidence of someone traversing a familiar landscape, her hand staking a claim on his arm as her lips brushed his cheek in a gesture of ownership. "Kale." Her French accent was both soft and surgically precise. "It has been some time." "Vivienne," he replied, his voice a chillingly neutral slate. Her gaze then shifted, a polite smile failing to conceal the sharp edge of her evaluation as she murmured, "How long does this particular phase of his tend to last? 2 months? 3? Don't trouble yourself, darling." He always reverts to the familiar. As the verbal assault connected, Kale's arm tightened around her waist with a firm, declarative pressure. He leaned in, whispering something near her temple that was lost to Vivienne. The words themselves were immaterial, overwritten by the sheer proximity of the act, but their effect was profound. Vivienne's smile faltered for a single, measurable beat before her composure was expertly reassembled. She pivoted and departed without another word. The subject was left with the phantom pressure of Cale's arm, a somatic imprint she knew would not be easily erased. Nearing midnight at the mansion, they found themselves on the terrace, drawn there by a shared, unspoken desire to postpone the inevitable debriefing. Below, Manhattan was a grid of cold luminescence. The chill prompted her to cross her arms as Cale stood apart, leaning on the balustrade. "You're going to inquire about her," he said. Less a question than an observation. "I was contemplating it," she admitted. He studied the city for a long moment before speaking again, his tone altered. It was not vulnerability, but the usual barrier between his interior world and his words had dissolved. "She desired the status my name provides," Cale stated, "but not the man attached to it. They are not synonymous." She remained silent. He continued, unprompted. "You're the first person in years who was unaware of my identity," he observed. "For that scenario, I have no prepared script." The atmosphere on the terrace seemed to lose some of its chill. Her attention was fixed on his profile, the severe line of his jaw, his profound stillness in moments of high consequence. The attraction was no longer something she could dismiss as purely situational, an after effect of a kiss that had created a false intimacy at Noir. He turned, meeting her gaze. The moment gained density, becoming a physical weight in her chest, a tightening of her throat. Their proximity had become too significant to be nothing. Cale's eyes dropped to her mouth for a heartbeat. Her breathing ceased. He remained still, and the space between them pulsed with unspoken intent. The vibration of Cale's phone broke the spell. He drew it out, his expression resetting as the mask of guarded control slid back into place. He answered, listened, and when the call ended, his dark eyes held a new quality. It was not alarm. It was an emotion colder and more primal. "What is it?" she asked. Cale observed her for 2 seconds. "Mateo Vargas was seen observing your apartment," he said, accompanied by 2 armed men. The cold returned with violent force. Chapter 5, the second collision, the descent. She returned to her apartment on Monday morning, driven by a client deadline and the fact that the raw memory of the terrace made it impossible to focus. She explained that she required her own workspace, a refuge from the oppressive gravity of his residence on her thoughts. He offered no protest, merely watching her with his placid intensity, before acquiescing with a completeness that ignited her suspicion. Her apartment was unchanged, a comfortable disarray of sketches and coffee mugs. She inhaled deeply, the familiar scent of her own territory acting as an anchor against the external chaos. Bex arrived 40 minutes later, carrying pastries and the pent-up energy of questions deferred since Friday. They worked through the morning in a productive quiet, the kind that exists only between people with no need to fill the silence. As she completed a sketch, she was entirely unaware of the 2 operatives Cale had positioned below. One in the lobby disguised as a courier, the other in a car with an ideal vantage point of the building's entrance. Soren had arranged the surveillance without her knowledge, an action Cale had approved on the same covert terms. She would have vetoed the measure, which was precisely why it was concealed from her. At 3 p.m, hunger asserted itself. Finding the fridge bare, she took her key and descended the rear service stairs. She favored that exit out of habit, a more direct path to the side street. A 2-minute walk led to the alley and 3 more blocks to the market. She did not know this route was a blind spot in Cale's surveillance network or that her neighbor in 4B, whose shyness she had misread, had been documenting her movements for weeks, reporting them to Mateo with the diligence of a paid informant. Mateo was half a block from the market. He seemed to materialize from nothing, yet his measured movements projected the patience of a hunter who has waited for the perfect opportunity. His expression was the same calibrated mask she recalled from Noir, projecting a control that was entirely manufactured. Sloane. Her name was spoken with the chilling finality of a scheduled event. She froze. "There is nothing to say, Mateo. This is a mistake," she stated. He eliminated the space between them. "You have no conception of who he is, of what he represents, or of the abyss you are approaching." "I am walking into my own life," she countered, attempting to move past him, but his hand clamped onto her arm. The grip was not one of jealous passion, but of cold, absolute possession. As he pulled her in, his other hand lifted toward her face, and his intent was unmistakable. In a flash of instinct, a brutal lesson from Bex became real as she twisted free, driving her elbow into his sternum. Mateo stumbled, more surprised than injured, his expression hardening into a threat more lethal than rage. His eyes became glacial as he recalibrated. And then, Cale was present. He had not rushed. This was the first detail that burned itself into her memory. He approached Mateo with deliberate steps, enveloped in a calm so absolute it was the most unnerving thing she had ever witnessed. There was no urgency, only the serene certainty of a man for whom speed is an unnecessary display of power. From her periphery, two other figures emerged, silent guardians moving with deadly grace. At their appearance, Mateo became perfectly still. Cale stopped a meter away and simply watched him, his presence emanating the crushing gravity of the Rienzo legacy, a power she was only just beginning to comprehend. Mateo met his stare with a look of pure, unwavering hatred. It was a chronic, calculated animosity, nurtured like a finely honed weapon. His voice was a low, incisive whisper. "You are on the wrong side of the line, Rienzo." He pronounced the name as if he were privy to its every dark chapter, its meaning in a world far removed from her own. The words struck her like a physical blow, a piece of Mateo's puzzle that had no place in her understanding. Cale remained silent. The two men moved forward, and Mateo accompanied them without a struggle. A chilling compliance that was more disturbing than a fight, suggesting he was already anticipating the next move. Back at the mansion, she demanded clarity. Cale offered her a carefully measured portion of the truth, enough to serve as a warning without inciting outright panic. He acknowledged having formidable enemies. Mateo, he explained, was an associate of dangerous people who utilized spies and armed protection. She was a target without a defender. The word Mafia was never spoken. She never asked, as if leaving the monster unnamed might keep it contained. But the deduction was unavoidable. Mateo knew Cale's true identity. Cale knew Mateo's. And she was the only player in their game who was blind. She sequestered herself in her room, tracing the wall's patterns until the silence became an oppressive force. A knock came. It was Soren, his face set with the grim resolve of one tasked with delivering news for which there is never a right moment. "Mateo is gone," he announced, his voice flat. His handlers were found 2 blocks from here, disarmed. A professional team with deep assets extracted him in less than 10 minutes. He paused. He had external assistance we didn't account for. My error. For Soren to admit an error was a rare occurrence, one that signaled a catastrophic failure more loudly than any formal report. The digital world intruded via a notification, a tag from a tabloid she vaguely recalled following. It featured an image of her leaving the estate, wrapped in Cale's coat. A detail the caption twisted into a narrative of Mr. Rienzo's passing amusement. The post framed her as a passing curiosity from a less than proper background, a sentiment Vivian Lacqua endorsed within 30 seconds. Her response was not panic, but a calculated retreat. a tattoo artist caught in a conflict born from a 10-second fiction, now subject to public scorn. This public exposure represented a contingency she hadn't considered, a breach of their unwritten terms. The open suitcase on her bed was the scene his knock interrupted. When she opened the door, his eyes moved from the luggage to her face, showing not surprise, but a profound weariness that pierced his public armor. "You're staying here until I know you're safe," he stated. Her retort was immediate. "You don't give me orders." A silence stretched between them before his voice returned, deeper and divested of its usual control. "No, but I am concerned for your safety." She studied him for 3 heartbeats, the hallway thick with their silent power struggle. Behind her, the suitcase symbolized a decision she was no longer certain of. "I know it was Vivian," he said, preempting her, "and I'm handling it." "I don't need to be handled," she countered sharply. "I am not a disease that needs a cure." "I am not treating you like a problem," Cale responded. A palpable shift occurred in his tone, shedding the layers of cold authority. His subsequent words were raw and disarmed. "I am treating you as someone who matters." The declaration was so alien that her mind stalled, leaving her physically motionless. She remained frozen in the doorway, her hand on the knob, captured by his gaze. The quiet between them was a question that would accept no immediate answer. "Are you going to see her?" she finally asked. "I'm on my way now," he replied, and then departed, leaving her in a state of limbo, the suitcase an open wound on the bed. She occupied the space between choices, understanding that while rage at the world was justified, flight was not a solution. 40 minutes later, the sound of his car confirmed his departure. She watched from the window, the suitcase a silent question at her back. He returned in less than an hour. She was in the kitchen preparing tea, a task neutral enough to anchor the storm in her thoughts. His approaching steps on the marble preceded his appearance in the doorway. "It's handled," he announced. "What did you say to her?" she demanded. He moved past her, retrieving a glass from a cupboard. "I made it clear that any action against you would precipitate a consequence she is unequipped to withstand." A beat of silence, "and that her involvement in this life is terminated, with or without your presence." Her hand, holding a cup, halted midair. "You said that." "I did," he confirmed, with absolute calm, as if reporting the weather. Thus, Vivian was removed from the equation, her return made impossible. Cale had executed this move without knowing if she would stay. This was another critical piece of the dynamic. She set her cup down. "Thank you," she murmured, the words feeling utterly insufficient. He met her gaze, his expression uncharacteristically open as he offered no verbal reply. Yet his silence was electric and intentional, a channel of shared understanding that resonated between them with the same frequency as the one on the terrace. A ringing phone in an adjacent room shattered the moment. Soren appeared, his face the grim mask of a messenger delivering disaster. "Matteo is gone," he stated, his eyes fixed on Cale. "We located his escort team. They were neutralized 2 blocks away. He had external support arranged. The abduction was efficient." Cale did not move, setting his glass down with deliberate precision. She recognized the stillness. It was his method for absorbing a threat. "How long since he was taken?" Cale asked. "Under 10 minutes, Soren confirmed. The silence that followed was different, laced with a violent, controlled urgency. She already knew the implications from Soren's earlier dispassionate briefing. However, witnessing Cale absorb the intelligence was a far more visceral experience. The way he became utterly still, his focus contracting to a cold, sharp point, made the peril more tangible than any report. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she finally perceived true care, not possession, but a profound concern for her safety and the price it entailed. "You're staying here tonight," he declared. It was not a command, but the logical end of a risk assessment he had just run, a conclusion she, in truth, had already reached. She did not unpack the suitcase, but neither did she close it. It was a choice enacted, not spoken. The open luggage remained in the bed, a silent testament to her suspended decision. She stayed, governed by the cold logic that fleeing now was an act of fear, not of freedom, a miscalculation she knew from experience led to ruin. They shared a meal in the kitchen, a room made human by warm lights, and a scarred cutting board. It was the only space in the mansion that felt truly lived in. With his sleeves rolled up, Cale revealed a different facet of himself, still formidable, but with one less layer of his defensive armor. After delivering his report on Matteo, Soren had departed. They were left alone with the mansion's silence, a presence that deepened the darkness. He cooked pasta while she watched from a stool, a glass of wine in her hand. The sheer domesticity of the act created a cognitive dissonance with the man who could clinically erase a problem like Matteo. "You know how to cook," she stated. "My mother would not have tolerated otherwise," he replied, his attention on the pan. "Italian?" she queried. "From Naples," he clarified, a carefully metered tenderness in his voice, the only version Cal Rienzo seemed to permit. "She would have also color-coded the library, with far more discipline than you." A laugh escaped her, its sound belying the tension she felt. Cale angled his head, the barest hint of a smile touching his lips, a feature that always disarmed her. They ate at the counter as their conversation, at first stilted, began to find a natural current. It was not forced. The ease came from two people carrying burdens, rarely exposed to light, with the kitchen's quiet creating a sanctuary that had not previously existed. He mentioned Nico without preamble, speaking the name with the familiarity reserved for those who are never truly absent. His younger brother, 22 at his death, possessed a spirit that far exceeded his physical form. He was killed in an ambush 5 years ago, the consequence of a turf war whose mechanics she could not grasp. For Cale, the wound was not grief, but a corrosive guilt born from the perceived failure of a protector. "You never discovered who gave the order?" she concluded, reading the spaces in his narrative. "Never," he affirmed, retreating into the profound quiet of a man who has carried a question for so long it has become integrated into his very structure. She stared into her wine, then offered a reciprocal vulnerability. "My father left when I was 12, she began. "He didn't die, he walked out. It's a different wound, devoid of clean grief, replaced by the slow work of detaching from a fault that was never yours." Cale listened with the intense focus he reserved for things of consequence, not formulating a response but absorbing her truth. "It's the reason I stayed with Matteo so long," she added, the confession flowing easily in the room's unexpected safety. She had mistaken a desire for stability for love, navigating with a broken compass from the outset. The silence that followed was connective, building a bridge from the new ground their shared truths had created. When he rose for more wine, she moved with him, an unconscious, synchronized drift. As she moved toward the counter, she came unintentionally close to Cale. Neither of them retreated from the sudden dissolution of their personal space. A stillness descended, and the ambient sounds of the kitchen were replaced by a weighted silence, thick with unspoken communication. Cale's expression was unguarded, a look she now recognized as a precursor to some raw disclosure. He lowered his head, a deliberate motion that granted her the power to interrupt. His gaze fell to her mouth, and her breath hitched, her mind fixated on the authenticity of this moment. So unlike the 10-second performance at Noir, the kiss he initiated shared nothing with their public display. That had been for an audience, a calculated necessity. This was slow, profound, and intended for her alone. His hand rested gently on her waist, his body a source of palpable heat as he created a protective barrier at her back. The kiss was a self-contained cosmos, yet one that ignited an immense gravitational pull toward everything beyond it. Her hand found his jacket in an unconscious motion, his intense focus causing the very framework of her thoughts to collapse just as the kitchen door swung open. Soren's intrusion was abrupt. He took 2 paces, assimilated the scene instantly, and withdrew with a masterful tactical fluidity. His heel caught the doorframe, followed by an Italian curse laden with a distinct hostile energy. Cale and she separated. A brief silence permeated the space before an involuntary laugh escaped her, a nervous discharge from a moment both surreal and deeply meaningful. In turn, Cale gave a true smile, a rare event that altered his entire countenance, searing the sight into her memory. "Urgent intelligence," Soren announced from the hallway, his tone flat and sterile, as if the preceding 30 seconds were a temporal anomaly. Cale held her gaze for a final beat, a look that was both a vow and an inquiry, which she received and stored without offering a response. Soren reappeared, his professional veneer perfectly intact, a tablet in his grasp. He placed it on this counter with a gesture of clinical dispassion. The screen illuminated a map of Manhattan's South Port, marked with 3 red points and 1 name. Varga, that resurrected the 2-year fiction she had been living. Varga, Soren stated, directing his comment to Cale. Movement at the South Port within the last 6 hours. 3 containers show registration discrepancies, and Matteo is supervising. This was a planned action, not a reactive one. Cale examined the map with his signature cold concentration, an attribute she now perceived through a more complex lens. "He is using the port for leverage," Cale remarked to Soren, but then his sharp focus shifted to her. It was a look that demanded comprehension, one that signaled the next phase would unfold in the shadows. She understood this to mean the peril was far greater. Chapter 7. The Hidden Truth. On Wednesday, Cale summoned her to his office, his tone a decree, not a request, signaling a decision made overnight that was now set for execution. She followed him down the hall to a large oak door, which he sealed behind them. He stood at the room's center, his typical composed expression now fractured by a deeper, more raw vulnerability. "I am more than a CEO, Sloane," he said. She remained quiet, allowing him the space to articulate his truth, knowing that interrupting Gala Rienzo at such a juncture would be a profound error. He then delineated the entire architecture of the Rienzo name, its purpose, its dominion over New York, his function as its leader, and the tangible, physical menace it embodied, a name with fatal implications. His delivery was surgical, each word precisely chosen, offering neither mitigation for brutal realities nor melodrama for the grim truth. She listened without any overt reaction. Her lack of tears or hysteria defied every projection she had made about her own response to such a monumental disclosure. Instead, she met his confession with a deep silence, which, as she had previously told him, was a far more alarming symptom of her distress than any outburst. When he was done, she requested to be alone. He consented, opening the door. She walked past him without physical contact, went to the bedroom and stared at the floor, adrift in a dissociative state for an untraceable period of time. 2 hours later, Soren delivered a concise knock, less a request for entry and more a notification of it. He sat near the window, tablet at the ready, carrying the demeanor of a man with information too vital to await her emotional equilibrium. "I have something to tell you," he announced, his voice uncharacteristically guarded. Mateo Varga is not simply a soldier for a rival organization. He was the one who provided Nico's location for the ambush 5 years ago. He engineered the setup, but he did not give the ultimate order. She processed the information for 3 full seconds before she could form a question. "Are you absolutely certain?" "I am," he confirmed, "and Kale is not yet aware. I am on my way to inform him." Soren departed, leaving her with this new information that reshaped Kale's narrative about Nico into a psychological horror she could not have previously conceived. She needed to breathe. The mansion, which had begun to feel like a haven, now felt oppressive, its expansive interiors contracting around her. She tried to rationalize her fear, arguing that Mateo was contained and the port was a separate theater of conflict. She repeated to herself, in the safest location in Manhattan. A necessary fiction that had no bearing on the truth. She moved down a side stairway and out into the garden, unaware of the eyes that tracked her every move. In the cold, quiet, October light stretched long shadows over the grounds. She found a stone bench in a secluded corner and folded onto it, cradling her head as she fought for breath and tried to mend her fractured thoughts. His approach was completely silent. The first sensation was a hand gripping her arm, a vice with immobilizing power. A second form coalesced from the shadows, and before she could formulate a defense, they were moving her with the swift, quiet economy of a perfectly executed abduction. A scream tore from her, but it was immediately muffled by a gloved hand. She was maneuvered into a car as the mansion's garden dissolved into the night. Their destination was a warehouse at the South Port, where the atmosphere was saturated with the smell of salt water and rot, and a silence that signaled a place forsaken by humanity. They fastened her to a metal chair in the center of the vast chamber, her wrists chafing against the restraints, 2 guards dissolving into the periphery. Mateo stood before her, his expression not of anger, but of a chilling, detached calculation. "Rienzo will exchange the South Port for your life," Mateo stated, delivering it as an unchangeable premise. "You have observed me for 2 years, she replied, her voice composed. "Do I appear to be an asset he would trade?" "My prediction is that he will not leave you here," Mateo answered. A flicker of cynical admiration crossed his face, a concession to a loyalty he could not personally fathom, a telling fracture in his psyche. After a moment, Mateo's voice grew quieter, as if confiding a venomous secret. "I know Soren told you I was culpable for Nico's death." His gaze was like a drill. "I calculated that it would break Rienzo, a flawed hypothesis." She just watched him for 2 seconds, letting his statement hang in the stagnant air. "You gave away his brother." "I gave away a set of coordinates," he corrected, taking refuge in semantics. "This is business, Sloane. It always has been. A principle you cannot comprehend." "I comprehend enough," she retorted. Kale appeared in less than 2 hours. The guard's abrupt stillness, a primal, instinctual fear, was the first evidence of his presence. The side entrance slid open, revealing him, Soren, and 4 others, who moved with the methodical assurance of a unit that leaves no variable to chance. He walked the warehouse's center, his calmness a more powerful force than any overt threat. He looked at her first, a rapid, all-encompassing scan, before his gaze fixed on Mateo. In that stare, now imbued with the truth of Soren's revelation, a different dynamic materialized. This was not a competitor facing an adversary. This was the gaze of a brother. Matteo recognized his fatal error in judgment as Cala's men closed the circle around him. Pride kept him stationary, but his expression hardened as his entire gambit turned to ash. "You know what I did," Matteo declared to Kali, "and you came here yourself. That is a weakness." "No," Kale replied, his voice deeper and colder than she had ever heard it. "It is the only consequence you have merited." Matteo did not struggle as Kala's men took him into their custody. He knew resistance would only escalate the severity of his situation. Then Kale and she were alone in the warehouse, enveloped by the smell of salt and a profound silence. He approached and began to release her bindings, his focus absolute, his touch both systematic and gentle as he examined her wrists before undoing the knots. Once she was unbound, his hand lingered for a second, as if seeking tangible proof of her well-being. She was quiet. He was too. During the drive back, the city's lights streamed past the windows like a silent film. Cale looked straight ahead for a long while. Then, without shifting his gaze, he placed his open hand on top of hers. A touch of simple presence, not of pressure. She let it rest there. He finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the road. "I know you must decide if this is a world you can survive, but I need you to know my feelings for you are not part of a strategy." She looked down at his hand covering hers, remaining silent. No words could capture the weight of that moment. She did not pull away. Yes, Chapter 8. She awoke on Friday morning to sunlight slicing through the curtains and an uncommon mental clarity, the kind that can follow a night of deep psychic resolution. Faint red imprints from the bindings were still apparent on her wrists. They were not painful, just present. A physical reality her mind was working to negate. For a long time, she gazed at the bedroom ceiling. She thought about Cale, the very antithesis of everything she believed she wanted. A man whose world entailed severe consequences, yet was the most authentic person she had met in a long time. Not because of what he shared, because he had shared little, but in his refusal to be anyone other than himself, and in the way his focus made her feel like the nucleus of any room. That, she determined, was a significant improvement. Bex arrived at 10 in the morning with 2 coffees and brittle energy of someone suppressing a tremendous panic. Cale had contacted her. She learned this from Bex, not from him. Another piece of data she filed away for later analysis. Sitting on the bed's edge, she absorbed the entire chronicle. The warehouse, the bindings, Matteo's cold, transactional speech, Cale's calm entrance that was both menacing and reassuring, the revelation about his brother and his hand upon hers. Bex's silence was a mirror reflecting the weight in the confession, as a still Bex was one in deep contemplation. After the words settled, she waited nearly 10 seconds, calibrating her inquiry. "Is your apprehension rooted in staying?" she queried. "Or in the sheer force of your desire to?" My lack of a response served as its own confirmation. "It's the latter," Bex affirmed, her voice a soft scalpel delivering a diagnosis honed by years of intimacy. And that is a signal not for retreat, but for heightened vigilance. She stayed for another hour, her departure punctuated by a crucial embrace, leaving unasked the questions for which there were no words. I was left in the estate's quiet with a decision already rendered by the soul, awaiting the mind's surrender. Elsewhere, Kyle occupied his office, his focus a fractured lens. Soren had entered twice with paperwork, and on both occasions witnessed Kyle's gaze moving across the text, a mechanical act devoid of comprehension. A deviation Soren silently catalogued. Upon his third entry, Soren halted at the threshold. "In all my years," he observed, "I have never witnessed your concentration so thoroughly dismantled." Kyle's eyes lifted from the documents, his face a testament to the accuracy of the statement. "In all my years," Kyle countered, "I have not had a catalyst of this magnitude." Soren withheld comment, departing with his typical precision, yet the posture of his shoulders suggested a subtle contentment. Early that afternoon, Soren's knock came again. He held a tablet, his expression that of an archivist, finally sealing a protracted and agonizing record. Kyle looked up from his desk. "Mateo's prosecution is proceeding," Soren announced. "The file was definitive. He has no remaining legal recourse." A beat of silence passed. Then Kale performed an act Soren had never witnessed. He placed his pen down with immense deliberation, as if releasing an unbearable load, and simply regarded it. "And the Vargas Syndicate?" he inquired, his tone meticulously controlled, a bulwark against the underlying emotional current. "Leaderless and exposed, their dominion is collapsing." Soren paused. "The European organizations have already submitted bids to acquire their territory. Their New York presence is eradicated." Kyle was still, his gaze fixed upon the pen in a prolonged moment of internal processing. Then, his voice low and stripped of its usual artifice, he said, "Nico was 22. "He was," Soren confirmed, offering no embellishment. The stark affirmation was sufficient. Kyle stood, moved to the window, and surveyed the tree-lined avenue, his arms crossed in a posture of absolute stillness, absorbing the weight of finality. Soren remained, a silent sentinel bearing witness to a grief that required no words. After a time, Kyle returned to his desk, took up the pen, and resumed his duties. This was not a cinematic resolution, but the only kind life offers. Quiet, absolute, and all the more burdensome for it. Mateo was incarcerated. The Vargas were gone from New York. The operative in 4B was identified and neutralized Thursday morning, Soren later informed me with dispassionate objectivity. The information landed with a cold, surgical precision. Every random encounter, the coffee, the perfectly timed opening of a door. My entire apparatus for threat assessment had been fundamentally compromised. Now, I understood the grim arithmetic required to prevent its recurrence. As for the man who betrayed our position 5 years ago, his ledger was closed with the same chilling finality Kale Rienzo applied to all matters of consequence. Soren conveyed these details to me afterward, his tone as sterile as a surgeon's report, but the image he painted lingered. Kale, a silhouette against the glass, a solitary pen on his desk, the office shrouded in an absolute silence. I grasped a fraction of it instinctively. Certain burdens are not lightened when set aside, they merely transmute into a different form. I sought him in his office late that afternoon. I knocked. He permitted entry, and as the door opened, I found him at the window, observing the street with crossed arms. When he turned and his eyes met mine, the impregnable armor of Kyle Rienzo revealed a fissure, the first true sign of vulnerability I had ever seen. The space was saturated with a silent, palpable gravity. She crossed the threshold. The lock clicked. In that stillness, the entire history between them materialized. The meeting at Noir, the napkin, the terrace, the kitchen, the warehouse, and the ghost of his touch in the car. She spoke into the suffocating quiet, a defense against its weight. "I will not feign a lack of fear for you," she confessed. "But the thought of leaving is more terrifying than staying." He held a deliberate pause, eliminated the distance between them, and then withheld the anticipated kiss, a strategic maneuver that left her utterly disarmed. He stood so near, the air felt combustible, his entire focus converging on her. The customary iron discipline was gone from his face. She saw the man behind the facade. "I know," he stated, his voice low and unvarnished. "And I refuse to squander this." Later, in the corridor, he cornered her against the doorframe, his hand landing beside her head in a pointed act of restraint. The suggestion of contact was infinitely more powerful than the touch itself. She understood he was arranging their next encounter, a profoundly disquieting realization. He pulled back, giving her a final look she had already committed to memory, and departed, correctly calculating she would remain frozen in place. She did. File notation. Chapter 9. The Dinner. The restaurant was completely devoid of patrons, yet every table was prepared. A sommelier addressed her by name, cementing the surreal theatricality of the evening. Cale had reserved the entire establishment. Seeing him there, alone, she recognized at once that this was a man who operated without compromise. He observed her approach, perfectly still, his attention a physical pressure, making no effort now to conceal its intensity. She wore a simple black dress she had felt ambivalent about. He made no mention of it, rising instead to pull out her chair with a seamless motion that felt less like courtesy and more like an essential need for her proximity. The atmosphere between them eased as, by a shared, unspoken agreement, they both dismantled their fortifications. He shared stories of Naples, of summers with Nico, of learning to cook as an escape from his grandmother's affectionate but dreadful cuisine. She laughed, a sudden luminous sound that elicited a genuine smile from him, softening the severe lines of his face. She reciprocated with stories of her studio, of a client whose tattoo she was convinced she'd ruined, only for him to come back asking for more work. Kyle's method of listening was a form of complete absorption. He was not merely awaiting his turn to contribute. Midway through the meal, he set down his glass, his gaze sharpening, heralding a shift. "I need to ask you something," he began, "and this is not a performance." She held her breath. "Be my girlfriend," Kyle proposed, his tone direct, an unambiguous offer devoid of subtext. "I understand who I am and what this life demands, but I also know I can no longer conceive of it without you." The silence in the vacant restaurant was absolute. She assessed him, affording the question the careful, silent deliberation she reserved for moments that redefine existence. "You will have to contend with my habit of color coordinating things," she said at last. He met her gaze. "I have already had the library remodeled." She released a laugh as he smiled, the conclusion feeling both elemental and preordained. Rising, he moved to her side, pausing with his face near hers for a sustained beat before he kissed her, heedless of any potential observer in the empty space. In the car, his fingers located hers within the dark void between their seats, a simple act that annihilated all remaining distance. She accepted his hand, watching the city's lights blur past, the quiet between them now feeling settled and profound. At the house, he led her down the upstairs corridor and paused at her door. He simply observed her. "You can remain in your room," he stated. The words a proposition, not a command. After a moment, she moved toward his room instead. He went with her. The true beginning was not when the door shut, but in the hallway. It commenced with the deliberate, proprietary placement of his hand upon her waist and the sheer force of his gaze, which contracted her entire world to that single point of contact. Inside, the room was dark, with Manhattan a constellation of distant lights. The kinetic energy from weeks of circling each other was a palpable presence. He cupped her face as he had at Noir. But this gesture was intimate, authentic. This was the antithesis of a performance. She recognized it as the most genuine experience she had had in years. He was deliberate, focused, and unhurried. He spoke her name, and the sound of it, stripped of his typical armor, was an impact she knew would resonate within her for a very long time. At dawn, she woke first into a silent house. Kyle slept beside her, appearing truly at peace in a manner she had never witnessed while he was conscious. Exposed, unencumbered, and liberated from the burden he constantly shouldered. In that instance, he was merely a man, a realization of profound and simple beauty. His eyes opened, finding hers instantly with their customary searing focus. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice soft. "It is," he answered, smiling. At 7 a.m., she messaged Bex. The response was instantaneous. "Well," she texted back. "Well." "Sloane Mercer, I demand a comprehensive debriefing immediately." In another part of the city, Soren overheard Kyle humming an Italian tune from the bathroom. He paused at the door for 2 seconds before departing with the faintest trace of a smile. Chapter 10. Existence began to settle into a form she had not engineered, but found she greatly preferred. During the day, she would go to her studio, followed by a quiet security detail to manage her enterprise and create her art. At night, she would come back to the mansion. Its simple cadence provided a stability that contradicted her previous, fractured notions of love. For 2 days following their dinner, her luggage remained packed upon her bed, a last testament to her impermanence. On the 3rd day, the packed luggage stood as a silent ultimatum, which Cale observed but did not address. That evening, he confronted her in the kitchen, his posture one of finality. "Establish your residence here," he stated, the words an offer, not an order. "I will not have my belongings waiting on your floor." She allowed the quiet to stretch, studying the tension that flickered across his jaw. "You are aware the studio is on the opposite side of the city," she challenged. "I am aware," he confirmed. "And that my day begins at 6 a.m. "I am aware." "And that I will be re-cataloging your entire library." "That renovation has already been sanctioned." She held his gaze a moment more. He had preempted every contingency with a level of foresight she was beginning to recognize as a potent form of devotion. "Very well," she conceded, "but the chamber remains under my jurisdiction." "It was my territory first," he countered with a faint smile. "It is now our shared space." I alerted Bex. Her subsequent outcry was of such a volume that Cale registered it from across the room. Taking a slow draw of his whiskey, his amusement unconcealed. We arranged to empty her apartment over the weekend. That night, from the mansion's terrace, the whole of New York glittered beneath us. I was held against his torso, enveloped by his arms in a placid silence that required no articulation. This entire affair began because I solicited a kiss from a complete stranger, I remarked finally. He remained silent for a beat. His tone, low and near my ear, was stripped of all artifice. "I know." He paused. "It was a sound judgment." I laughed, and he secured his hold as the metropolis shone on, wholly indifferent. This marks the conclusion of Case File 1. Case File 2 is compiled and acquirable for a minor contribution. A conspiracy was unfolding against Kel Rienzo, motivated not by dominion or wealth, but by something profoundly intimate. The architects were mapping his very soul, his respiratory rhythms, his lapses in focus, the precise moment he permitted himself a sense of security. The asset deployed for this mission was named Victoria Lauren, a woman with a seraphic face, and Cale had no conception of the threat. The man who perceived danger in all shadows was blind to the one at his flank, but Sloane observed everything. The single thread she pulled unraveled a reality more dire than any could have foreseen. because in their world, the cost of protecting the king is frequently the queen. As stated, this is a preliminary assessment from Case File 2. To view the complete, unedited documentation, you must use the first link within the pinned comment. The inquiry proceeds there. That hyperlink is the sole ingress to the unabridged second file presented without interruption or redaction. The path of inquiry is now set. The examination of this second file is yielding paradigm-shifting data, compelling a more granular inquiry. In this space, we will deconstruct the most severe forms of pathological enmeshment, a genuine dark romance. The intensity of the material renders it unsuitable for the public forum of YouTube. This private archive allows for an uncompromising analysis, ensuring my findings reach you in their intended form. Be advised, the public-facing channel is no longer active, leaving this as the exclusive avenue to fund my team and our work chronicling these unflinching case studies. Developments are forthcoming. I will see you via the first link. Disturbingly, shadow entities have begun to hijack our audio archives, mirroring the events of the narrative by recasting it on YouTube. To trace the canonical narrative and be the first to access its evolving installments, you must search My Stories by Lena on YouTube to locate the authentic dark romance record.